Welcome back. At this time, we can go ahead and prepare everything that we need for the board to work. So the idea is that we have a data model which allows us to create boards, and we can then use that data model to store the boards in the cloud, and that's exactly what we want to do, right? So we need to know the details about a board. So I think let's just get started with it. You can pause the video and think about what would be the things that have to be in such a project board, so to speak. Okay, so if we look at this here, what we can see, it has an image, it has a board name, and then what else would we want to display about the board or know about the board in the backend? All right, so I'm going to tell you what we will start with. It's not everything that we will do for a board later on, but I think it makes sense to start with a name for the board, then with an image, or at least a string for the image, or the URI, the link, so to speak. And then we need to know who created the board. And then we also would want to know who is assigned to the board. So these would be the information that we need to know for now. Later on, we also potentially want to store the information about the different cards that are in the board and all those kind of things. So let's get started with the basic model first though. All right, so therefore, I'm going to create a new class in here in the models. So create new Kotlin file class, and I'm going to call this one board. All right, so this board is going to have, or it's going to be a data class. So we keep it super simple. We don't need to have any additional information in there, right? So let's make it the data class, no functions or anything, just the basic data, and we will make it parcelable later on. So what we need is, as I said, the name, which will be a string. Then we need the image, which will also be a string. And by the way, we need to separate them with a comma, of course, because that's as if it was in the one line. Then I want to know who created it. So created by, which will also be a string, and this should be the unique user ID or the username. We will see later on. And then we need to know who it is assigned to. So assigned to array a list of strings, because now it could be multiple people. So it needs to be an array list. All right, so I'm gonna say that it's an empty array list for now. All right, and now let's make it parcelable. So parcelable, and we need the colon here. And of course, it's with a capital P here. Once we have that, we can import parcelable, and then we need to make adjustments here. So add parcelable implementation. So it adds the constructor, write to parcel, creator, and everything. And here we need to add parcel dot create string array list, just like that. Also, we still need to make some changes here. So I'm just gonna say it should directly return 0. Well, that's a fine way to do that actually. Write to parcel is lacking one thing, so it's still missing our list here. So write string list with our assigned to. I'm going to say that it should do with the parcel, all of those things. All right, so then the error disappears and things seem to work. But here, parcel write string, well, we can also say parcel dot write string list here. And then here we need to force it here with a bunch of exclamation marks. Okay, so this is going to be our board. And we need to do that, by the way, because read string is at nullable. So you can see it returns a nullable, so a variable that could potentially be null, and I cannot pass a null to the constructor because it always expects something. That's why we need to use the exclamation marks here. Okay, so that was step number 1. Our board is prepared now. We will have to adjust it accordingly if we ever want to store more information about the board, but for now it's going to be fine. Now let's go over to the main activity, and here I want to create a new variable which will be a late init variable, and it will store the username in here. And where I'm gonna set the username is in our update navigation user details. So here I'm gonna set up user name is user dot name. Why is that? Well, the thing is, at that point we get the username. So as you might have already noticed, we put all of our database relevant code directly into our Firebase class or Firestore class here, because if Firestore for whatever reason shouldn't work in the future anymore, we want to just replace the class and do all of the stuff that the class does instead of having to replace everything. And that's why we create functions which are not directly related to Firebase in here, where we're not dependent on Firebase, but we are just dependent on a specific variable, right? So here we're just waiting for a user object that is passed to us so that we can then get the name from that object and store it in our variable username. Now at that point we can pass in the username to the create board screen. So here when we click on the fab create board, set on click, that is where we start the activity, right? And it would make sense to send some more information with this intent. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new intent here, val intent, and then we will add something to the intent. So intent put extra, and here I'm just going to say at the position of name, so constants name, and it's this one here, I want to pass in the username, so username. All right, so then start activity with the new intent that we prepared. So why can we do that? Why can we already pass in the user here? Because onCreate is the thing that is called first, right? Well, what is also called is Firestore class load user data, and load user data is called, and inside of here our update navigation user details is called, in which we set the username. So basically in our onCreate, this line of code is executed before this one, which means that the load user data function is called inside of Firestore, which then calls, of course, this update navigation user details in which the username is set, and then we have the username prepared and ready for our set on click listener with our fab button, so our floating action button. Now that we sent over the name, let's also retrieve the name, and that is in our create board activity. So let's go ahead and catch it here. First of all, we need a late init var, which will be my username of type string, and then we can catch it in our onCreate actually. So here, after the setup action bar, if intent has extra details for the constant dot name, then do something. And in this case, just assign the username. So set the username that we prepared up there, which will be intent get string extra at the position constants dot name. So now we sent over the username to the create board activity, and we have it here. This way we don't have to get the username here again and have another database request, because what we try to do is to have as few requests as possible. All right, so now that we use the boards, let's also go to our constants and add a new name for the boards here as well. So we have users. This is our collection of users. And now let's create the same for our collection of boards. Const val boards will be a string called boards. So now if we create a collection here in our database, it will be the boards collection. So here it will be called boards. Okay, but we don't need to do it here in our Firebase interface, but we will do that in the code itself. So let's move over to our create board activity, and let's also create a function here which will let us know that the board was created successfully. So fun board created successfully, and it will pretty much be the same information here as in our user created successfully. So height, progress bar, and that will of course only work if our create board activity is inheriting from our basic activity or base activity. Yeah, that was the one. Now we can go ahead and use the height progress dialog, and then we call finish. So we close this activity. Okay, so this was a little prediction or preparation, so to speak, for the actual creation of the board. All right, and now at that point we can go ahead and create the board. And where would we do that? Well, the creation of the board, of course we would think it's in the create board activity, but as I said, I try to put everything that has to do with the database connections and creating database entries and updating them in the Firestore class. So here we created one where we loaded the user, so this is how we get the information, but then we also had one where we created the user, right? So here document update, well, that's updating, and this is register user, this is where we created the user. So now we're going to create a function which is going to be very similar. So you can see we need an activity here. In this case it was the sign up activity, but we're going to use the create board activity, of course. Then we don't want to have a user but a board. Then we don't want to use constant users but constant boards. We still want to create a document but not with the current user ID. Then we want to set it and have add-on success listener. So let's go ahead and just build that code. So it's going to be very similar. So create board, which will need an activity, which will be of type create board activity. And then we need to have a board, which will be of type board. All right. So then we can now go ahead and use that same approach, mFirestore collection. So let's do that. mFirestore. And by the way, we need to import board. So mFirestore collection, we pass in constants.boards. So we're going to give this collection a name, and it's going to be boards. All right. So then we can now go ahead and add a document, which I'm not going to give any further details here. So it's going to generate a document for me with random numbers and values, or just a random ID, so to speak. And then I want to set it. So I want to set a board with the set options. So you can see data any type of data. In our case, it's going to be a board object that I pass into the database. And then we can add the set options, and I want to merge the data. Okay, so there are multiple different options here. What I'm saying is merge the data if they already exist. So don't overwrite directly, but merge it. So then I have an add-on success listener here, in which I of course want to run some code, which is going to be for now a log entry and a make text. So here board created successfully is what I want to write there. And then on top of that, I would also like to run activity.board created successfully, which is going to be this function here, which is just going to hide the progress bar and which will finish it. Okay, so that is the creation of the board if it worked. So what shall we do if it failed? So we add an on failure listener here as well. So we need that here, add on failure listener. Now here we get an exception, and what we want to do with the exception is our decision. So first of all, I'm going to run hide progress dialog for that activity, and then I'm gonna add an entry for the logcat. So log an error, saying error while creating a board, and here it's called exception. So then we know at least what the information is, what the error is about, and everything. Okay, so this was just a preparation of creating the board. The actual testing of that is what we will do in the next video, because we are getting to the point where the individual versions of finally seeing something new, finally testing something, are getting bigger and bigger, or the code that we need or the steps that we need in order to achieve something visible in the database are getting longer and longer. So I need to have multiple videos until the point where we actually finally see something. Okay, so I'm sorry for that, but otherwise I would have to create 30 to 40 minute videos sometimes, because this is advanced stuff, right? So we would need to do all of that in one video, and I think it just makes sense to have these little breaks in between. So see you in the next video.